Well, let's look a little more about look at a little more about JavaScript here. You remember last time we had a page that looked like this. It didn't have this thing here though, and when we clicked, oh wait, something different's happening. When we clicked before, we got an alert box, but now we're not getting an alert box. It's actually writing it to the page. What happens if I click the lion? Oh yeah. All right, so now rather than using an alert box and having that pop up, it actually just writes it right onto the page. How do we do that? Well, we're going to take a look at that. But before we do all of the specifics, let's take a look at just a couple of other things. First of all, I want you to notice that at the end of every statement in JavaScript, we have a semicolon. So we have a semicolon here, we have a semicolon here. You notice that we do not have a semicolon at the end of a closing brace for a function. Now when we're defining an object the way we are up here, we still have the semicolon at the end, but for anything that's the body of a function, we don't follow it with a semicolon. So thing to remember, number one, when you create statements in JavaScript, you end the statement with a semicolon. Next, let's talk about elements. We've talked about this briefly before, but it bears some repetition. Either in the body or up in the head, we can have elements. An element is simply something, if we have open and close tags, that starts with the open tag and ends with the close tag. So that's an element right there. So this is a div element. It has the ID quests, and inside, in between the tags, it has some text. This is another element, div element. Now you'll notice that the IMG doesn't have a closing tag, and that's okay. For things that just have singleton tags, just that whole tag itself is the element. So this here is an image element. So now we know what elements are. And elements have lots of information that gets stored about them internally. For instance, this div, it has to know that its ID is going to be the string quests. It has to know that inside of it, it's supposed to be displaying this text. So there's some of the information that there would be inside this div. Now you'll notice that here, we have the answers or the strings we want to put out coming out inside a div here, and that's our ants div. And you notice that the ants div starts empty, but we have styled it a little bit. We've given it a border, a 1 pixel solid black line border. We've given it a margin and some padding, which is why we have some space in here. This doesn't collapse to a single line because of the padding that we've given it. And so there's information about this div too, even though it has no HTML between the opening and closing tag. It does have an ID. The system has to keep track of that. It does have some styling, and the system has to keep track of that. Well, we can access all of that stuff by using document.getElementById. What document.getElementById does is say, give me an ID, and I will give you access to all of the information about that element. And that's pretty powerful because it means we can change that information. Here, for instance, we're adding an event listener. This says, okay, element quests, right here, we're talking to you. I'm adding something to you. Here's what you do. You have to listen for a click, and if you get clicked, then you have to go do this function right here. Do whatever that function tells you to do. And so that's why this event listener gets added to this element, and this event listener here, this part here, gets added to the image. Well, what do these functions do for us here? Let's take a look. Excuse me. Here is appns.answer, and it has one line of code. And this one line of code uses document.getElementById antsdiv. So it says, hey, antsdiv, listen up. You're about to do something here. The dot right there tells us what part of the div we're going to change, or what part of the div's internal information we're going to change. And the part that we're going to change is the inner HTML. You can think of the inner HTML as representing everything between the open tag and the close tag of the div. So if I were to come in here and type lilac and save that and reload, you notice we now have the string lilac in there. And why is that? Well, that's because I put it in between the tags. Now when I take it away, excuse me again, we save and reload, and you notice that it's not there anymore. But when I click this, it appears. And why does it appear? Because by doing this right here, we say, okay, take this thing here and put it into the inner HTML of this. And so it's as if we had come in here and typed the word lilac. Now you notice that this code doesn't actually change, but internally here, now rather than being empty, the inner HTML of the div that has the ID ants div has this text in it right there. Now this equal sign we don't read as equal. We read it as gets, G-E-T-S, gets. Because what happens is that we're saying this thing here, that is the inner HTML of the ants of the element with the ID of ants div gets this particular value. So we're saying this here, this part of this thing gets lilac. And so read this as gets instead of equals. And what about the lion? Well, the same thing. Now you'll notice there is one thing that's a little different here, and that is that we have a really long string, so I broke it into two pieces. And you can break it into as many pieces as you like, as long as you put plus signs in between. This just kind of glues it all back together. So that plus this with that plus sign and this makes it as if I just had all of this followed immediately by all of that. So that's just a convenient way in case we have to break our strings across one or more lines. We can just paste them back together by using plus. Now, there is one problem with this. If I want to clear that, then I have to use this here, right? I have to empty or reload the page. And once I start clicking stuff, I'm always going to have stuff in here. There's no way to clear it, at least without reloading the page. But we can clear it without reloading the page if we want to. Save that and come back to here. Now this is almost the same, but we've added a little bit more. We've added two more things, in fact, and they're both clicks. When we click ants div, so let's see what happens. I'm going to do this, and this says when I click ants div, I go to clear answer. So I click this, oh, and look, it cleared. And then I also have this new element down here. You see, here's a button. And if I click the button, it also clears it. So it clears it if I can do that, and I can click the button and it clears. I can do that, I can click the div and it clears. And it happens because I've added these two things here. Creating a button is really easy, not any trouble at all. You use an opening button tag, you use a closing button tag, and you'll see that the text inside the button, that clear answer, goes right in the middle between them. We have to give the button a type, and it might be strange to say, okay, I'm creating a button, hey, your type is button. But it turns out that there are other types of buttons that we can do that will cause the button to do things automatically. If we just want a nice generic button and we want it to do what we tell it to and not do anything on its own, then we just put in type button. We give it an ID so that we can access it by ID, and so on a click, it comes up to here. So how did we get that to clear? How did we get everything to disappear? Well, it's easy as pie. Well, no, that's actually not good because pie is not easy. It's hard to make pie, but it's easy. It's much easier than pie, let's say that. So here we are. Here's our ants div, our inner HTML, and instead of putting all kinds of text in there, we just give it the empty string. We give it the string that has no characters at all, and that wipes out everything else that was in the inner HTML to begin with. So now we're really starting to do some interesting things. We don't have to just rely on alert boxes. We can actually change what's happening on the page as we go using JavaScript.